Mark walked home from the library with his backpack sitting high on his shoulders. The streetlights had just turned on, and the road looked quiet and empty. He had stayed late to finish a history project, and he felt proud that he did not give up. Mark was 16, tall for his age, and always carried a small notebook where he wrote reminders for himself. He wrote goals like finish homework early, help mom with groceries, and keep calm no matter what happens. His father taught him that calm thinking could save a person from bad choices. Mark tried to follow that lesson every day. A police car rolled slowly beside him. Its headlights washed over Mark's jacket and the books inside his clear folder. Mark stopped walking, because he knew sudden movement could look suspicious to someone who already expected trouble. 2 officers stepped out, and their shoes hit the pavement with sharp sounds. One officer looked at Mark's face, and then at his hands. The other officer looked at the backpack as if it carried something dangerous. Mark felt his stomach tighten, but he kept his voice steady. He told them he was walking home from the library. He said he had schoolwork, and he could show it. The officers asked questions that felt less like safety and more like accusation. They asked why he was out late and why he was walking in this neighborhood. Mark answered each question with respect, even when the tone made him feel small. He pulled out his student card slowly and held it up where they could see. He also opened his folder to show papers with his name on them. Mark expected the officers to relax when they saw the evidence. Instead, one officer told him to put the backpack down. Mark did it carefully and stepped back like he was instructed. A neighbor across the street watched from a porch. A car passed and slowed for a moment, then kept going. Mark realized that people often looked away when things felt uncomfortable. He tried to keep his breathing even, because panic would not help him. One officer moved behind him and told him to turn around. Mark turned around, and his cheek pressed against the cold side of the police car. His arm was guided upward in a way that hurt, and Mark gasped. It was not a small discomfort, but Mark focused on staying still. He said he was not resisting. He said he wanted to cooperate. The officers did not explain what rule Mark had broken. They did not ask for a parent's number at first. They spoke in short words that sounded like orders, not conversation. Mark felt fear, but he also felt something else, which was unfairness. He had done the right things, and it still was not enough. Mark thought about his mother at home, waiting for him to return. He thought about how she would worry if he did not show up. He thought about his father, who worked long hours and still found time to call every day. Mark's father was a public leader, but at home he was simply Dad. His father had taught him that power was not for showing off. His father said real strength was knowing when to speak and how to stay respectful. Mark held onto that memory like a rope. He asked the officers if he could call his father. One officer laughed and said Mark did not look like someone with an important father. The words stung, but Mark did not argue. He repeated the request in a calm voice. After a pause, one officer told him he had one call. Mark's hands were shaking, and he struggled to unlock his phone. He pressed the contact that said Dad, because it was the fastest to find. The call rang once, then twice, then connected. Mark tried to keep his voice steady, but it cracked from stress. He said he had been stopped while walking home and he needed help. His father did not raise his voice, but the calm became serious. His father asked where Mark was and whether he was safe. Mark gave the street name and a nearby store sign. His father told him to stay calm and to hand the phone to an officer. Mark held the phone out. One officer took it with a look that said this would be funny. The officer spoke in a confident tone at first. Then the officer's face changed in small steps. The smile faded. The eyes widened slightly. The officer looked at the other officer as if searching for support. The officer stepped away from Mark, turning a little so Mark could not hear clearly. Mark could still hear his father's voice, even through the tiny speaker. It was firm, controlled, and sharp like a clean edge. Mark's father asked for names and badge numbers. Mark saw the officer's hand tighten around the phone. The officer gave a badge number. The officer also gave a name that sounded like Reed. The other officer said his name was Cole. Mark's father asked why a minor had been treated this way without explanation. The officer tried to respond, but his words sounded less certain now. Mark's father asked whether their body cameras were on. The officers glanced at each other again. The phone was handed back to Mark. Mark's father told him to stay where he was and not to say anything extra. Mark's father said help was on the way. Mark's father also said Mark had the right to be treated with dignity. Mark felt a strange mix of relief and shame. He was relieved because someone strong was stepping in. He felt shame because he knew the officers had judged him before they knew anything real about him. A few minutes passed like a long hour. The street stayed quiet, but the air felt heavy with tension. The neighbor on the porch kept watching, now with a phone in hand. Another car stopped farther down the street, and someone took a video from the sidewalk. Mark could hear the officers speaking in lower voices. They no longer sounded as loud or sure. A second police vehicle arrived, followed by an unmarked car. A woman stepped out of the unmarked car, wearing a plain jacket and a serious expression. Her name was Dana, and she was a supervisor from the department. She walked straight to Mark, not to the officers first. She asked if Mark was hurt and if he needed medical help. Mark said his arm was sore, but he was okay. Dana nodded and told him to sit on the curb for a moment. Her voice was steady and respectful, and it made Mark feel human again. Dana then turned to the officers. She asked them to explain the reason for the stop. Officer Reed spoke, but his story sounded thin and unsure. Dana asked for details, and Reed struggled to give them. Dana asked to review the camera footage. Dana also asked why Mark's school papers were ignored. The silence that followed said more than words. Mark watched the scene like it was happening to someone else. He wanted to go home, eat dinner, and forget the whole night. But he also knew that forgetting was how problems stayed alive. He looked at his notebook inside the clear folder. The top page showed a line he wrote that morning. It said, "Stay calm, stay smart, and stand up for what is right." Dana gave Mark his backpack and told him he was free to go. Mark stood slowly, keeping his shoulders back even though his body felt tired. Dana told him that a full review would happen. Dana also told him that he did the right thing by staying calm. Mark nodded, but he did not feel proud yet. He felt changed. He felt older than he had felt that morning. As Mark walked toward home, he kept the phone in his hand. His father stayed on the line, listening to Mark's breathing. His father told him he loved him and that none of this was Mark's fault. Mark finally let out a long breath he had been holding for too long. The streetlights still glowed the same way, but the world felt different now. And Mark knew the next day would not be quiet, because the truth had already started moving. The next morning arrived quietly, but the house where Mark lived felt heavy with unspoken thoughts. Mark sat at the kitchen table, staring at his cereal without tasting it. His mother moved around the kitchen, trying to act normal, but her eyes kept returning to him. She wanted to ask many questions, yet she waited, knowing Mark needed space. Mark's arm still ached, not badly, but enough to remind him of the night before. Every small movement brought back the sound of voices and flashing lights. He wondered how something so ordinary as walking home could change a person so deeply. Mark's father arrived earlier than usual that morning. He did not wear his work suit, only a plain shirt and jacket. When he entered the kitchen, he did not speak right away. He placed his hand gently on Mark's shoulder. That simple touch carried safety and strength. Mark looked up, and for the first time since the stop, his eyes filled with tears. His father sat beside him and listened without interrupting. Mark spoke slowly, describing every moment again. He explained how he answered politely and followed instructions. He explained how fear came even though he did nothing wrong. His father nodded, not surprised, but deeply concerned. He told Mark that the system was meant to protect people, yet sometimes it failed. He also told Mark that silence allowed failure to grow. Mark listened carefully, feeling both nervous and supported. At school that day, Mark felt different walking through the halls. The lockers looked the same, and friends laughed as usual, yet Mark felt separate. He noticed how teachers looked at him with extra care. Word had spread faster than he expected. Some students whispered. Some avoided eye contact. One close friend named Leo walked beside him without saying much. Leo did not ask questions, and that kindness mattered. In history class, Mark struggled to focus. The lesson was about justice and laws from long ago. The irony felt sharp. Mark wondered how rules written on paper could fail in real life. He raised his hand and asked a careful question about accountability. The teacher paused, then answered thoughtfully. The room grew quiet, and Mark realized his voice mattered. After school, reporters waited outside the building. Mark did not speak to them. His father had advised him to wait. That evening, the house filled with serious conversation. Lawyers and advisors spoke in calm tones. They discussed procedures, reviews, and official steps. Mark listened from the stairs, feeling like his life had become a discussion topic. Later, his father sat with him alone in the living room. He explained that the case would be handled carefully and fairly. He promised that facts would matter more than noise. He told Mark that bravery did not always mean being loud. Sometimes bravery meant staying steady while others reacted. Mark nodded, holding on to those words. That night, Mark could not sleep easily. Every time he closed his eyes, the street appeared again. He remembered the cold surface of the car and the sharp commands. He reminded himself that it was over. Still, his heart raced. He got up and opened his notebook. He wrote about fear, fairness, and hope. Writing made the weight lighter. Days passed, and the situation grew larger. Official statements were released. An investigation was announced. The officers involved were placed under review. Mark heard adults say this was important. He also heard others say nothing would change. Those words hurt more than the memory itself. At school, Mark was asked to speak to a counselor. The counselor listened with patience. She told him that reactions like his were normal. She reminded him that his feelings mattered. Mark left her office feeling understood. One afternoon, Mark and his father visited a community center. People gathered there, not to shout, but to listen. Mark stood beside his father, feeling small but proud. His father spoke about fairness and responsibility. He spoke about trust and repair. He spoke without anger, but with firmness. When Mark was asked to speak, he hesitated. The room waited quietly. Mark stepped forward and spoke in simple words. He said he was scared that night. He said he followed the rules and still felt powerless. He said he wanted a future where respect came first. The room stayed silent, then filled with applause. Mark felt his chest loosen for the first time since it happened. He realized his story was not just his anymore. It belonged to others who felt unseen. That realization brought responsibility, but also purpose. As they walked home that evening, Mark looked at the sky. The stars were faint but steady. He knew challenges were still ahead. The review was not finished. Opinions would clash. Voices would rise. Yet Mark felt stronger than before. He had spoken without anger. He had been heard without shouting. He understood now that courage could be quiet and steady. And as he closed his notebook that night, Mark knew the story was far from over, but he was no longer afraid to face what came next. The weeks that followed moved slowly, yet each day carried new weight for Mark. News programs spoke about responsibility and trust, and Mark heard his own story repeated by strangers. He learned how quickly a private moment could become public once it touched something bigger. At school, assemblies were held about respect and understanding. Teachers spoke carefully, choosing words like fairness and listening. Mark sat among his classmates, feeling both seen and exposed at the same time. Some students approached him with quiet support. Others stayed distant, unsure what to say. Mark did not blame them, because fear often makes people unsure. He focused on his studies and tried to keep his routine steady. He walked home earlier in the evenings now, not because he was afraid, but because he wanted peace. Every step felt more thoughtful than before. The investigation continued behind closed doors. Mark's father kept him informed without overwhelming him. He explained how reviews worked and why patience mattered. Mark listened carefully, learning how systems moved slowly but left lasting marks. He understood that truth was not always loud, but it had weight. One afternoon, Mark was invited to attend a review meeting as an observer. The room was plain, with long tables and serious faces. Dana was there, calm and focused. She greeted Mark with respect and asked how he had been feeling. That simple question reminded Mark that his experience mattered beyond reports and forms. As discussions unfolded, Mark listened to explanations and timelines. He heard words like procedure and responsibility repeated many times. He noticed how language could soften or sharpen a situation. When mistakes were acknowledged, the room felt lighter. When excuses appeared, tension returned. Mark did not speak much, but he observed everything. He watched how accountability required courage from all sides. He realized that growth often came from discomfort. The meeting ended without dramatic moments, yet Mark left feeling changed. Outside the building, sunlight warmed his face. Mark breathed deeply and felt grounded again. He knew progress did not always look dramatic. Sometimes progress was simply staying committed to doing better. At home, Mark wrote more often in his notebook. He no longer wrote only goals. He wrote reflections about power and responsibility. He wrote about how trust could be broken and rebuilt. Writing helped him understand his emotions without fear. One evening, Leo came over to study. They worked quietly, sharing notes and jokes. At one point, Leo asked how Mark was really doing. Mark paused, then answered honestly. He said he was learning how to carry the experience without letting it define him. Leo nodded, understanding more than words could say. Community meetings continued, each one calmer than the last. People began to listen more than they spoke. Mark noticed how tone could change the direction of a room. He admired his father's ability to remain firm without anger. That balance became something Mark wanted to practice in his own life. One weekend, Mark volunteered at the same community center. He helped younger kids with homework and reading. Some of them looked up to him with curiosity. Mark realized how easily influence could be passed on. He chose to lead with patience and kindness. A young boy asked Mark why people were talking about him online. Mark smiled gently and said he had learned something important and wanted to share it. The boy accepted the answer and returned to his book. That simple exchange reminded Mark that not every explanation needed details. As time passed, updates from the review brought clarity. Steps were announced to improve training and awareness. Mark felt cautious hope. He knew real change required time and commitment. Still, knowing effort was being made mattered deeply. At school, Mark gave a presentation in civics class. He spoke about responsibility and voice. He did not mention his experience directly. Yet his classmates understood the meaning behind his words. The teacher thanked him for his insight. Mark's confidence grew quietly. He no longer felt the need to prove himself. He understood that dignity came from self-respect. Each challenge had shaped him, not hardened him. One evening, Mark and his father sat on the porch. The street looked peaceful, just as it had before everything changed. Mark asked his father how he stayed steady during difficult moments. His father said strength came from knowing why you stand firm. He said values were anchors in uncertain waters. Mark thought about that as he looked ahead. He knew the road forward would have challenges. Yet he also knew he was not alone. Support, honesty, and courage surrounded him. As the night grew quiet, Mark closed his notebook. He felt gratitude for growth, even when it came through hardship. He knew his story was still unfolding. And with steady resolve, Mark prepared to face whatever the next chapter would bring. The final stage of the story began quietly, without noise or crowds, but with deep meaning for Mark. Months had passed since the night that changed his life, and the world around him slowly settled. The review process reached its conclusion, and official results were shared with care and clarity. Changes were announced, not as promises, but as actions already in motion. Training programs were updated, supervision rules were strengthened, and communication standards were revised. Mark listened as these updates were explained, feeling a calm sense of closure forming inside him. At school, life began to feel normal again. Mark focused on exams, projects, and plans for the future. Teachers treated him as a student, not a symbol, and that felt good. Friends joked with him like before, and laughter returned naturally. Mark realized that healing did not erase memory, but it softened its sharp edges. One afternoon, Mark received a letter from the department. The letter acknowledged mistakes and expressed commitment to improvement. The words were formal, yet meaningful. Mark folded the letter carefully and placed it inside his notebook. He did not see it as victory, but as progress. Mark's father watched him closely during this time. He noticed how his son had grown steadier and more thoughtful. They spoke often about choices, leadership, and responsibility. Mark no longer listened as a child, but as someone forming his own values. At a final community gathering, Mark stood beside his father once more. This time, the room felt hopeful rather than tense. People spoke about moving forward and rebuilding trust. When Mark was asked to say a few words, he stepped forward calmly. He spoke about learning to use his voice wisely. He spoke about choosing understanding over anger. He spoke about believing that change was possible when people stayed honest. His words were simple, but they carried weight. The room responded with quiet respect. Later that evening, Mark walked home alone. The same streetlights glowed above him, steady and unchanged. The road felt familiar again, not threatening. Mark breathed deeply and felt grounded in the present. At home, Mark opened his notebook for the last time in this chapter of his life. He read the early pages filled with goals and worries. He read the middle pages filled with fear and questions. He read the later pages filled with clarity and strength. He smiled softly, recognizing the journey he had taken. Mark wrote one final line before closing the notebook. He wrote that courage grows when guided by purpose. He wrote that fairness begins with listening. He wrote that dignity belongs to everyone. That night, Mark slept peacefully. The past no longer followed him into his dreams. He knew challenges would come again in life. He also knew he had the tools to face them. As morning light filled the room, Mark woke with quiet confidence. He prepared for school, ready for the day ahead. The story that began with fear ended with understanding. And Mark stepped forward into his future with strength, calm, and hope.